The chosen ones at the residence were all paragons of beauty, but Julian was the most exquisite. 4 years, he was a living ornament for Leo, the family's volatile heir. He served as Leo's shadow, his plaything, and ultimately his scapegoat. When the time came for accountability, it was Julian who was sacrificed, taken by the family's grim-faced associates and thrown into a secure holding cell far from the estate's gilded halls. He thought his life would end there, but his fate was to be traded from one monster to another, from the decadent East Coast to the rugged plains of the West. There, a different man would claim him. That man would hold his chin, assessing him like a spoil of war, and wonder aloud how the supposed titans of the East could so carelessly damage such a precious thing. He was savage, uncivilized, and base. He saw Julian not as a boy, but as something to be possessed, and in his possession, Julian found a torment that rivaled even death. The residence was a place that consumed people, leaving nothing but bone, and Julian was the most delicate of those bones. Gnawed on for so long by the young heir that Leo's peculiar madness had seeped into him. It was the cloying sweetness of a room kept too warm, mingling with a child's thoughtless cruelty. At the tender age of 10, a medical procedure had been forced upon him, a chemical castration meant to render him harmless, docile. It nearly killed him. He survived to become the lowest of the service staff, learning to make himself invisible in a place where visibility was a liability. That was until Leo ascended as the family's heir apparent. He was brought before Silas, the family's chief of staff. The old man's face was powdered unnaturally white, his lips a slash of red, his forehead a roadmap of deep wrinkles. But his eyes were dead, glassy, and still. The sight of this polished ghoul was so arresting that Julian stared, a fatal lapse in decorum. Silas's smile was predatory as he questioned who had given Julian permission to look at his betters, calling him an ill-bred cur before ordering him to be disciplined. The slap was sharp, and a deep, throbbing ache bloomed in his cheek. In that flare of pain, a cold thought took root. Would he one day become like Silas, a hollowed-out creature, neither man nor ghost? He later realized he would never be so fortunate as to live that long. Lined up with the other candidates in the courtyard of the main house, Julian felt like a piece of porcelain being appraised for auction. His bruised face was deemed an imperfection, and he was shoved to the very end of the line. The protocol was simple. Leo would make his selection from the first few, and the rest would be assigned to menial labor. Julian was destined for a life of scrubbing floors, an anonymous existence that might, with luck, lead to an anonymous end. But then Leo's prized Persian cat, a ball of pure white fur, bolted. Leo, a boy of 12 with the temperament of a toddler, chased it. He followed the cat to the back of the line, scooped it up, and then he looked up and saw Julian. A wide grin split his face. He declared it looked like a peach had grown on Julian's cheek. He drew closer, his breath smelling of expensive imported candies, and pressed his face against Julian's swollen skin before biting down hard. The pain was shocking. Leo recoiled, spitting, complaining that it tasted awful. Julian's legs gave out and he dropped to his knees. Silas knelt beside him, his voice oozing deference as he offered to dispose of the peach for his young master. Leo, puffed with authority, asked how one disposes of a peach. Silas's reply that one buries it so a tree might grow was delivered with a chilling casualness. Julian's blood ran cold. This was a death sentence. He was too terrified even to beg for his life. After a moment of thought, the jewels on Leo's designer watch glittering as he tilted his head. Leo gave his verdict. He agreed they should get rid of it. Julian's body went limp. But not in the ground, Leo added. In his bed. He wanted to sleep with the peach. And with that, he skipped away, cat in his arms. Silas's demeanor shifted in an instant. He knelt by Julian, his touch surprisingly gentle on the sore cheek, whispering that the boy should be grateful. Without Silas's intervention, the young master would never have noticed him. Julian mumbled his thanks, pressing his forehead to the cold flagstones again and again. The heir's bed was so soft it felt like sinking into a cloud, and the air was thick with the scent of a custom fragrance that made his head spin. He had been scrubbed clean and brought to the room like a prize animal, trembling. Leo looked him over with intense curiosity, noting that his peach had no fuzz. He pulled away the hand Julian used to cover himself, his gaze roaming freely before settling on the scar from his procedure. With an innocent cruelty, he asked why it was so flat. Shame, sharp and hot, pricked Julian's skin, and he couldn't form a word. Leo just giggled, like a child with a new toy, and threw himself onto Julian, commanding him to be his pillow. He held him that way for 7 years. Julian grew from 10 to 17, Leo from 12 to 18. Julian never fell out of favor. In fact, the heir's attachment only deepened. A diet of the finest foods and a wardrobe of designer clothes gave his frame a lustrous, healthy veneer. His skin was pale and smooth, his eyes long and dark. He was more beautiful than any of the scions of other powerful families, but it was a gilded cage. Inside, he was decaying. Leo was genuinely stunted, his emotional intelligence seemingly arrested at the age he'd been when he chased his cat. But as his body matured, his games evolved. He learned of desire, but only as another tool for torment. He would call Julian his little peach, holding him close while his teeth and nails left behind a constellation of bruises, often drawing blood. He would whisper that Julian was like a little bird with a broken wing that couldn't fly, a direct jab at his physical incompleteness. The words, no matter how many times he heard them, still brought a hot flush of shame to his face. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he would not live to Silas's age. This boy would, sooner or later, break him completely. Leo's instability made him an incompetent heir, and control of the family's vast political and financial empire fell to his grandmother and her relatives. The family's associates, unwilling to blame the heir for any downturns, aimed their accusations at the one who was closest to him. The sycophants who once flattered Julian now turned on him, fabricating stories of his arrogance and abuse of power. Leo couldn't protect him, he could barely protect himself. With a single directive from the matriarch, Julian's world collapsed. He was stripped of his fine things and thrown into a cold, damp security cell. The world shrank to bad food, the scuttling of rats, and the icy chill of shackles. He thought this was the end, that rotting here was a kind of release, until the day Isabella appeared at the door. Leo's sister was dressed in couture, a designer silk scarf held over her nose and mouth. Her eyes were filled with undisguised contempt. She remarked on what a rotten peach he had become, her laugh like the crinkling of dry leaves. He struggled, the chains rattling, and lowered his head to the floor in a gesture of submission. She told him she could save him, that he would come with her. Her voice dripped with the condescending charity of the powerful. He knew it was not a rescue, but merely a different kind of judgment. Isabella was being sent west for a politically arranged marriage. She took him with her. Others whispered of his good fortune, his miraculous escape. Only Julian knew the truth. She was taking him along to settle a debt for her dead lover. It had happened 2 years before at a high-profile political gala. A brilliant young Rhodes scholar, handsome and impossibly bright, had been the center of attention. Julian, standing beside Leo, had watched the young man with a profound, hopeless envy. He was everything Julian could never be. His gaze lingered too long. Leo, in a fit of pique, had shattered a glass and ordered the scholar to be removed. In an instant, the family's power was leveraged, and the scholar's promising future was annihilated. His reputation ruined so thoroughly that he took his own life. That scholar had been Isabella's fiancé. Julian's crime was a single, longing glance. He accepted his fate and joined Isabella's convoy heading west. The iron shackle remained on his ankle, a rhythmic, clinking reminder of his doom. 2 months of harsh travel were enough to weather his delicate skin, stripping away the manufactured glow of his former life, leaving only a dull, gray pallor. Isabella, passing him one day, casually remarked that he was less a peach and more a weed. And so, he was no longer a peach, he was a weed. Isabella was married to the son of a powerful Western landowner in a lavish ceremony. Julian, like a piece of trash, was kicked into the stables to live with the livestock. His days were spent mucking out stalls and feeding the animals. The wind in this part of the country was coarse, feeling like a blade against his face. The chilblains on his hands would break, heal, and break again, the smell of manure a constant reminder of his lowly state. But Isabella was not finished with him. She spread salacious stories of his time in Leo's bed. On this rugged frontier where masculine prowess was everything, he became the lowest kind of joke. A group of drunken ranch hands cornered him one evening. Their words were foul, their breath sour with whiskey. They backed him against the cold stable wall, saying they wanted to see the famous plaything from the East Coast, to see what was so special. Escape was impossible. A rough hand tore his pant leg, exposing skin that was startlingly white against the rustic backdrop. The laughter was deafening. As another hand reached for his remaining clothes, the immense weight of the humiliation crushed him. He thought of ending it, of slamming his head against the wall. But even in death, he knew they would likely string up his body for sport. Just as he closed his eyes, bracing for the final, desperate act, a sharp whistle sliced through the din. The men's laughter died. They looked afraid, muttering that Conan was coming for his horse. They scattered like birds before a hawk. He was left half-clothed and trembling. Then he saw him. He was tall and solid like a mountain. His young face held the sharp, untamed look of a wolf. His skin was bronze, his eyes deep-set over a proud nose. A faint scar cut diagonally across his jaw, adding to his formidable presence. A magnificent gerfalcon perched on his shoulder, its keen eyes fixed on Julian. A custom Bowie knife hung at his hip, and a leather riding crop swung from his hand. He was terrifying. One look was enough to make Julian's soul shrink. The hand holding up his pants trembled, and the fabric fell. As he bent to retrieve them, the man walked toward him. He said nothing, his shadow engulfing Julian completely. A pair of calloused, warm hands moved around Julian's waist. He tensed, expecting another assault, but heard only a soft click. The man had fastened a sturdy leather belt around his waist, securing his trousers. His voice was a low rumble, with an accent Julian didn't recognize, as he asked if it was too tight. Julian mumbled his thanks, his heart hammering, desperate to escape the suffocating intensity of his presence. He tried to step around him, but a muscular arm blocked his path like a steel bar. The man's gaze shifted to a horse grazing nearby, then back to Julian, his eyebrows raised in a clear invitation to ride. Julian had never ridden a horse before. At the residence, he had been the horse, crawling on the floor to bear Leo's weight. Before he could respond, the man grabbed him by the collar and hoisted him over his shoulder like a sack of grain, striding toward the most impressive of the stallions. He was thrown onto the horse's back, and the man swung up behind him, his solid chest pressing against Julian's back. Strong arms wrapped around him to take the reins. Just as he was told to hold on, the horse shot forward like an arrow. The wind roared, the prairie a blur of green. He squeezed his eyes shut, clinging to the horse's mane. The man's voice was a command in his ear, telling him to open his eyes. He obeyed, trembling. The sky was a vast, brilliant blue, the clouds so close he felt he could touch them. The speed was no longer terrifying. It was a pure, exhilarating release, as if he were shedding the last 13 years of humiliation and oppression with every hoofbeat. He had never felt so free. The man finally reined in the horse by a clear stream. He dismounted first, then lifted Julian down. Julian's legs were weak, and he stumbled. The man steadied him, sitting him down by the water's edge. They lay side by side in the soft grass, the gerfalcon preening on a rock nearby. The silence was profound. The man broke it, asking where he came from. A flush of heat rose in Julian's face as he quietly insisted he was a man. A low chuckle was the only reply. The man asked his age. 19, he answered, his head bowed. At 19, a man on these lands was a warrior. A shadow fell over him. The man used his knuckles to tilt Julian's chin up. The pressure was gentle but firm. He told Julian to look at him, his dark eyes like whirlpools, drawing him in. After years of serving Leo, Julian knew how to read power. This man, Conan, was no mere rancher's son. Julian turned his head away from the searing gaze, his voice trembling as he asked him to keep his distance, explaining that he was a person of low repute. Conan laughed again, and an arm snaked around his neck, pulling him closer. He could feel the man's warm breath as a calloused thumb wiped a streak of moisture from his cheek. The touch was clumsy, almost rough, and it made him flinch. His horse had vanished. They would have to walk back. By nightfall, Julian's strength was gone. The prairie wind cut through his thin clothes. Conan pointed to a dark opening in a hillside, a cave, and told him they would rest there for the night. He had no energy to resist. He simply did as he was told. Conan expertly built a fire, its dancing light pushing back the cold and dark. Julian huddled as far from it as he could, his teeth chattering. Conan told him to move closer. When he didn't, the man reached out and pulled him into an embrace. His body was a furnace, and Julian was a block of ice. Conan remarked on how soft he was, squeezing his arm with a sort of detached curiosity. Julian tried to speak, but no words came out. Conan took his frozen hands, his calluses rasping against Julian's skin. Then that hand began to move upward, sliding beneath his shirt, unfastening the simple ties. A jolt went through Julian, and he reflexively swatted at him, a weak, pathetic gesture of resistance. Conan's expression didn't change. A low, mocking laugh rumbled in his chest. He asked if Julian still thought he was some precious treasure. He knew. He had known all along who Julian was. He said that if Leo could play with him, so could he. The word play was a poison dart. The brief warmth, the freedom of the ride, it was all a lie. In this man's eyes, he was the same as he had been in Leo's. A toy, a thing for amusement. Humiliation and despair flooded him, and tears streamed down his face, dripping onto Conan's rough hand. Conan paused, using his thumb to roughly wipe the tears away. He said he would be much better at this than a boy. His version of better was still an invasion. He stripped Julian's clothes with practiced efficiency and pushed him down onto the dry grass. The firelight flickered across his intense features, his eyes burning with a primal hunger. He surveyed Julian's naked body like a hunter examining his kill, his gaze lingering on the old bruises before settling on the scar that marked him. He commented that it was an interesting feature. His kiss tasted of strong liquor, not the clumsy bites of a child, but the skilled assault of a conqueror. His gentleness was more gentle than Leo's, but his ferocity was 10 times greater. He knew how to provoke a response, how to make a body surrender, how to inflict a very specific kind of pain. And he was stronger with far more stamina. The ordeal was long, stretching from night until noon the next day. When it was over, he sighed in satisfaction. His damp chest pressed against Julian's cold back, his hand stroking his spine as if calming a frightened animal. He whispered in his ear that he couldn't let him go now, that Julian was the real treasure, the one who could melt his bones. Julian didn't answer. He had no strength left. The inside of his mouth tasted of blood from where he had bitten his own lips. A tide of self-loathing drowned him. What was the point of being alive, only to be passed from one cage to another? The desire to die was overwhelming. He gathered his last reserve of energy and bit down hard on his tongue. The expected agony never came. A hand like a vice clamped his jaw, forcing it open. 2 rough fingers pried his teeth apart. Conan's voice was laced with rage as he demanded to know if Julian wanted to die. He sat up, pulling Julian around to face him. He ordered Julian to bite him, shoving the fingers of his other hand into Julian's mouth. Despair and rage made him reckless. He bit down with all his might, tasting the salt of Conan's blood. He began to sob, biting and crying, pouring all his pain and humiliation into the act. Conan's brow furrowed, but he did not pull away, simply stared, letting Julian bite until he was exhausted. When he finally let go, Conan slowly withdrew his hand, the fingertips mangled and bloody. He looked from his hand to Julian's tear-streaked face and sighed. He said he was truly trying to be good to him. A high fever followed, and Julian lost consciousness completely. He awoke to the sound of many voices. He managed to open his eyes and saw the flickering light of a large bonfire. A crowd was gathered. In the center stood Isabella, dressed in her finest. She greeted Conan as he entered the camp, her smile forced. Her eyes, like a snake's, found Julian slumped over Conan's shoulder. He tried to move, to hide from her venomous gaze. Conan made a soft shushing sound, then walked straight past Isabella, carrying Julian toward his own private lodge. Though his mind was clouded, Julian understood. Conan was the heir, Isabella's husband by arrangement. And Julian was a dirty secret, now paraded openly for all to see. Conan placed him on his own bed and tended to him personally. He was clumsy but persistent, feeding him medicine and wiping his hot forehead with a damp cloth. But Julian wanted none of it. When Conan brought a bowl of bitter medicine to his lips, he turned his head, and what little he swallowed he immediately vomited onto Conan's chest. Conan's expression turned dark. Just as Julian expected an explosion of anger, Conan drank a large mouthful of the medicine himself, then leaned down, pinched Julian's jaw, and forced the liquid from his mouth into his. Julian's eyes flew open, staring at the face so close to his, a face full of savage anger and strange focus. His mind was a maelstrom of confusion and cold dread. He did not die. After nearly a week, he was able to sit up, propped against soft pillows. The pain in his body was a dull, constant ache. Conan entered, bringing the chill of the outside with him. He dismissed the attendants and strode to the bed, his large frame casting a long shadow. He leaned over, his calloused thumb stroking Julian's pale, gaunt cheek. His eyes held a look of undisguised, possessive admiration. He laughed softly, his breath hot against Julian's ear, telling him how beautiful he was, like a fragile sprite from the snow-covered mountains, born with a body designed to drive a man mad. He said he had tasted him and was now addicted. Julian shuddered and tried to pull away, but Conan easily pinned his wrists, pulling at the half-healed wounds and making him gasp in pain. Satisfied with his reaction, Conan leaned in to kiss him, his other hand tearing open Julian's loose, sleeping robe. Julian's plea was a weak, hoarse whisper. Conan merely chuckled and told him his opinion didn't matter. It was another punishing, endless ordeal. He seemed to have limitless energy, turning Julian over and over like a doll. Julian bit his lip until it bled to keep from crying out. All he remembered was the shifting shadows on the ceiling of the lodge and the hot, damp weight of Conan's body. When it was over, he lay like a dismantled puppet, unable to move a finger. Conan, satisfied, held him and fell into a deep, contented sleep. Julian stared at the faint light of dawn, feeling utterly exhausted, body and soul. 2 days later, he was able to stand. As he was steadying himself against the bed frame, the flap of the lodge was thrown open and Isabella stormed in, her face a mask of cold fury. She struck him across the face. The blow was surprisingly light, nothing compared to the discipline he'd received at the residence. But the humiliation it carried was sharper than any physical pain. She hissed that he was a vile thing. First, he had caused the death of her fiancé, and now he had come to seduce her husband. She asked what right he had to exist. He lowered his eyes and knelt on the floor. She was right. He was vile, a broken man who had defiled a powerful woman's marriage bed. She told him to die and make the world cleaner. She pulled a beautiful, jewel-encrusted dagger from her belt and threw it at his feet, ordering him to use it and get out of her sight. He stared at it. It was a work of art. To die by such a beautiful weapon seemed a fitting end. His trembling hand picked it up. The cold metal was a shock. He unsheathed the blade, the polished steel reflecting his own pale, numb face. He closed his eyes and drove the blade toward his neck. A sharp cry echoed in the lodge. A white shape flashed past, and a searing pain shot through the back of his hand. It was the gerfalcon. Its talons tore the dagger from his grasp. The lodge flap opened again and Conan stood there, his face as dark as a thundercloud. The gerfalcon circled once and landed on his shoulder. Isabella's face paled. Conan ignored her, his eyes fixed on Julian's bleeding hand and the dagger on the floor. He walked slowly toward Isabella, his voice like ice as he asked who she was. She stammered, confused, and he repeated the question, his tone demanding. She drew herself up and declared that she was Isabella, his wife. Conan laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. He pointed a finger at Julian, still kneeling on the floor. He said his wife, his Isabella, was him. The lodge was utterly silent. Isabella stared, her eyes wide with disbelief. Conan clarified that the true Isabella was Julian. As for her, she could go back to where she came from. The balance of power had shifted. Her family's influence was waning while his was growing. She was no longer a valuable asset. Her face lost all its color. She looked from Conan to Julian, and a terrible, broken smile twisted her lips. She understood, she said, and would no longer disturb the master and his Isabella. Her retreat was stiff, her back ramrod straight. He later heard she took her own life on the journey east. Perhaps he was to blame for her death, but he was just a bone tossed from a palace. He had no control over who gnawed on him. After she was gone, Conan walked to Julian. Without, he backhanded him, a powerful blow that sent him sprawling. His ears rang and the taste of blood filled his mouth. He was hauled up by his collar, and Conan's rough fingers were suddenly gentle as they traced the swelling on his cheek. His eyes were a storm of sick tenderness and raw dominance. He growled that Julian's life was his body was his. He forbade Julian from dying until he himself was dead. Julian, stunned, could only stare. Conan ordered him to nod. He nodded. Conan asked if it hurt. Julian whispered that it did. Then get your revenge, Conan told him, a strange smile playing on his lips. Spurred by some unknown courage, a culmination of all the pain and rage, Julian lunged forward and bit down on Conan's jaw, putting all his strength into it. Conan grunted but didn't push him away. When Julian finally released him, Conan touched the teeth marks and laughed. He called him delicate, saying his bite was like a kitten's scratch. He then lifted Julian into his lap, stroking his back like he was calming a wild animal. Desire stirred in him again. He kissed the tears from Julian's eyes and whispered that he was his princess. Julian choked out that he was a man. Conan's voice was absolute. A man can be a princess, he said. A man can be his wife. In that moment, Julian understood. In this savage world, the strong make the rules. Soon after, the old patriarch died, and Conan seized power in a storm of blood and fire. He was the new king. His first decree was to name Julian his consort. It was the highest honor he could bestow upon his favorite plaything. Conan brought him back to the East Coast, to stand before the now powerless Leo in the grand reception hall of the residence. Leo still wore his expensive clothes, but his eyes were vacant. When he saw Julian standing at Conan's side, a flicker of recognition ignited in their depths. Like a child spotting a lost toy, he scrambled from his chair and ran towards him, arms outstretched, crying out for his peach, asking for a bite. The familiar, innocent cruelty in his voice sent a chill of ice through Julian's veins. He instinctively stepped back. But Conan was faster. The Bowie knife was in his hand in a flash, its cold edge resting against Leo's slender neck. His voice was lethal as he warned the heir that one more step would be his last. The sight of the blade terrified Leo, and he burst into tears. Attendants rushed to pacify him. As they were escorted out, they could still hear Leo's wails, begging for them to give him back his peach. On the journey back west, Conan's mood was foul. He swore he would kill Leo, his arm clamped around Julian's waist like a vice. Julian asked quietly if he was planning a coup. Conan snarled that it was a matter of a man's pride, a tacit admission of his jealousy. His hands began to wander, his touch punishing. Julian tilted his head and rubbed his cheek against Conan's stubbled jaw, a gesture of feline submission. He whispered that he knew the layout of the residence, its security. He could be of use. Conan lifted him, setting him on his lap to face him. His gaze was hot and intense. He said others would handle such things. Julian had a more important task. He bent his head, his lips tasting the skin of Julian's neck, leaving a dark mark. His only job was to serve him well. The carriage swayed, and within its close confines, Conan made his desires known. He commanded Julian to call out his name, his actions growing bolder. "My king," Julian gasped. It wasn't forceful enough. "Master," he whispered, closing his eyes in shame, surrendering to the relentless rhythm Conan dictated. Conan would always treat him as a woman, as a conquest. But perhaps this, for a broken thing like him, was the best possible outcome in a cruel world. He was, if nothing else, a master of endurance. And Conan, for all his savagery, offered a brutal kind of sanctuary. He was alive. Perhaps he would even live to be an old man after all.